Drinking wine with Mr. Jennings shortly before his death.
We believe those are the prints of the killer.
Wilson considered one final piece of crime scene evidence.
Fingernail scrapings were collected in the case, and they were DNA tested.
Could a small DNA sample seal the defense's case?
The laboratory reported that there was a mixture of DNA that occurred from two people. One of those individuals was positively identified as Mr. Jennings.
So who was the second person?
The other DNA was from somebody else that was not Mr. Stagg.
It was the final revelation for the defense.
There was not a single iota of physical evidence that connected David Stagg to the murder of Bill Jennings.
Defense attorney Tom Barth now had a clear picture of what he believed happened in the hours leading up to Bill Jennings' death.
They'd had a fight, and David Stagg left there at 11:30, quarter to 12, something like that. After David left, Bill was depressed because of the fight, as anybody would be. He continued to drink. He wrote the suicide note. He did not go through with the suicide. He either called somebody and somebody came over, or he went out somewhere and met somebody. But in either event, somebody came back to the house. There was an argument. There was a fight. He was taken over to the birdcage, and he was asphyxiated in the corner of that birdcage, and whoever killed him wanted him dead. There was no motivation for David Stagg to kill Bill Jennings.
Barth believes science backed his theory.
The forensic evidence in this case was critical to David's defense.
Mr. Jennings himself had actually written all of the letters on the computer.
David Stagg had no injuries at all, period.
It's not Mr. Stagg's print, but some other person.
We believe those are the prints of the killer.
The other DNA was from somebody else.
David Stagg did not kill Bill Jennings.
But was there another side to this story? When prosecuting attorney Scott Toth considered the case, he believed evidence showed Stagg was guilty.
The only person that could have possibly been responsible for this murder was David Stagg.
And the prosecution hired its own experts to prove their case.
It's possible that an assailant under these conditions could come out of the fight with no injuries.
The fingerprint evidence was disputed.
You can't tell if that was left there within minutes or within hours or within days.
And when the case goes to court,
It was mind-boggling for me.
there would be an unexpected twist. David Stagg had been charged with the murder of his partner, Bill Jennings. Their friends believed he was innocent.
They tried to get David to do plea bargains, and he absolutely refused. He said, I'll go to jail and spend the rest of my life there before I will admit to something I didn't do.
The defense believed they had a strong case, but so did the prosecution. And prosecuting attorney Scott Toth set out to prove Stagg's guilt.
We know David Stagg was the individual that killed him.
Toth challenged Stagg's theory that Jennings had committed suicide.
What do you think may have happened to him? I think he committed suicide.
David, almost unbelievably, continued to maintain that not only didn't he kill Bill Jennings, but that Bill Jennings committed suicide.
Toth believed Stagg had staged the murder to appear as a suicide.
David Stagg was one of the few people that knew that Bill had this history of possibly taking his own life.
The defense had suggested Jennings had written his own suicide note.
We believe Bill wrote the note because he had had a fight with David Stagg early in the evening. He had been drinking alcohol. He was depressed.
But Toth believed Stagg had forged the letter.
The person that typed the fake suicide note wants the reader to believe that Bill Jennings sincerely loved and missed David Stagg. That's completely inconsistent with what we know about that relationship. We know that immediately leading up to Bill Jennings' death, he and David were having difficulties. All indications are that Bill Jennings wanted to end his relationship with David Stagg.
Toth turned to computer expert Mark Johnson to help confirm his suspicions.
That computer was sent to me, and I was asked to do the computer forensics on it. I was able to look at roughly 7 suicide notes that I had found on the computer ranging back about a year and a half.
After scrutinizing these documents, Johnson identified a pattern.
All the other prior suicide notes that we found were in a .doc format. In fact, all the files that we found were either in a textual format with a .txt extension or a DOC extension.
Johnson saw a discrepancy between the suicide note from the day Jennings died and the previous documents.
It was not saved in a format that Mr. Jennings uses. It had that extension of .com. There was no evidence that Mr. Jennings had ever saved a Word document as a .com extension.
The discovery was critical for the prosecution's case.
Based on what I found on the computer, I think it's unlikely that Mr. Jennings made that last suicide note. Mr. Stagg, from my information, was not prolific with the use of computers, so someone who was not prolific with computers but was using the internet may think that all files are saved with a .com extension.
The evidence seemed to incriminate Stagg.
Since David Stagg obviously was aware of past suicide attempts by Bill Jennings, and since David Stagg has continued to insist, even in the face of all the overwhelming scientific evidence in this case, that this was a suicide, and the only logical conclusion anybody can make was that David Stagg was the individual that typed out that fake suicide note.
Toth believed he had established the accused had written the suicide note as part of a cover-up, and he disputed the defense's theory about a third person.
Somebody came over, or he went out somewhere and met somebody.
To prove his point, Toth looked at Jennings' lifestyle.
There simply is no evidence to suggest that Bill would have engaged in any sort of high-risk behaviors, such as meeting strangers and bringing those individuals to his house.
Bill's former partner, Michael Ball, supported this view.
From what I knew about Bill, he would not be inclined to randomly pick up someone and take them home.
Toth then began to piece together a history of violence in Jennings and Stagg's relationship.
We know that this relationship at times became physical. And we know that during those physical altercations, David Stagg was the primary physical aggressor.
In general, I was told that the relationship was volatile. I heard about the domestic abuse later, closer to the time of Bill's death.
About a month or so prior to the homicide, Bill's niece reported that there was a specific occasion that she remembers when she noticed that Bill had a black eye. Bill seemed to indicate that he had gotten into a physical altercation with David Stagg.
And the violence escalated out of control.
Like in many altercations, you get to a point of no return, where one of the individuals takes it to the next level. This is not a case where you have any sort of financial motive to kill somebody. This is a case of rage.
Had David Stagg been pushed over the edge?
Bill Jennings was planning on breaking the relationship off with David Stagg. We believe that he probably did break the relationship off the night that he was murdered.
Toth